Space was cold and endless, stretching beyond the reach of imagination. Stars flickered like faint, dying embers in a vast ocean of blackness, too distant to offer warmth or light to the colonies that now floated in the emptiness. There had been a time when humanity believed it could conquer the stars, spread across the galaxy, and forge new worlds. But those dreams had long since crumbled, and now, what remained of humanity clung to survival on the edges of forgotten planets, far from the light of their dying sun. The ship, Vanguard, drifted silently through the dark space, its engines long dormant. Once a symbol of human ambition and hope, it now floated aimlessly, a relic of a forgotten era. Inside, Captain Layla Carell sat alone in Command Center, her eyes fixed on the endless void beyond the viewport. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional hum of the ship's failing life support systems. It had been weeks, no months, since the Vanguard had last made contact with anyone. The colonies, scattered across the distant reaches of the galaxy, had fallen silent one by one. Some had succumbed to the collapse of their fragile ecosystems, others to internal strife, and the rest, well, no one knew for sure. Layla had once commanded a crew of hundreds, but now only a handful remained, and even they had become mere shadows of their former selves, worn down by the endless isolation and the creeping despair that had taken root in their minds. Layla's thoughts drifted back to the last transmission they had received from the outer colonies. It had been a garbled message, barely intelligible, but the words still echoed in her mind. The light is fading. We cannot hold on. They are coming. Who they were, no one knew. It had been the same with every colony that had fallen. First, the lights would dim, power would falter, the atmosphere generators would begin to fail, and communications would be cut off. Then, the silence. And finally, the cryptic warnings, messages that spoke of an unknown force, of something lurking in the darkness, just beyond the reach of human understanding. Layla rubbed her temples, trying to shake off the weight of exhaustion that had settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She hadn't slept in days, not properly. Every time she closed her eyes, she was haunted by dreams of the dead colonies, their cities empty and cold, the stars blinking out one by one. Captain Carell, a voice crackled through the intercom, pulling her from her thoughts. Layla turned toward the console, recognizing the voice of Lieutenant Damon Rook, one of the last remaining officers aboard the ship. He had been with her since the beginning, a steady presence through the chaos and the endless uncertainty. "I'm here," she replied, her voice rough from lack of use. "We've picked up something on the long-range scanners," Rook continued. "It's faint, but it looks like a distress signal. It's coming from the direction of Colony A7. Layla frowned. Colony A7 had been one of the first to go dark, nearly a year ago. No one had heard from them since, and it was assumed that whatever had happened to the other colonies had also consumed A7. "Is the signal clear?" she asked, already moving to the console to bring up the data. "Not exactly. It's weak, but it's consistent. Whoever's sending it, they're still alive. At least for now." Layla's fingers danced over the controls, bringing up the signal on the main display. It was barely more than a whisper, a faint blip against the background noise of space. But it was there, pulsing rhythmically, like the last beat of a dying heart. "We're heading there," she said, her voice resolute. "If there are survivors, we have to help them." Rook hesitated. "Captain, we don't know what's out there. The last transmission we got from A7, it didn't sound like anything we've ever dealt with before." "I know," Layla said, her gaze hardening, "but we can't just leave them." The truth was, they had no choice. The Vanguard supplies were running low. Their power reserves were dwindling. If they didn't find help soon, they would be just another drifting relic, lost in the darkness. Colony A7 was their last hope, however slim it might be. "Prepare the ship for jump," Layla ordered, "and get the crew ready. We're going in." The ship lurched as it dropped out of hyperspace, the stars around them stretching momentarily before snapping back into place. The dark silhouette of Colony A7 loomed ahead, its massive structure barely visible against the backdrop of deep space. The colony had been built on an asteroid, one of many that orbited a distant gas giant in the outer reaches of the solar system. It had once been a bustling hub of activity, a beacon of human ingenuity and resilience. But now, it was dark, its lights extinguished, its docking bays empty. "Scan the surface," Layla ordered as they approached the colony. "I want to know what we're dealing with." Rook's fingers flew over the console, bringing up the sensor data. "No life signs on the surface," he reported. "At least nothing we can detect. There's power in some parts of the colony, but it's minimal. Looks like most of the systems have gone offline." Layla narrowed her eyes. "What about the signal?" "It's still there," Rook said, his brow furrowing. "Coming from deep inside the colony. But it's faint. Whoever's down there, they're running on emergency power." Layla leaned back in her seat, her mind racing. The colony was dead, or close to it, but something, or someone, was still down there, sending out that distress signal. They couldn't ignore it. If there were survivors, they had a duty to help them. "Take us in," she said, her voice firm. "Prepare a landing party. I'm going down there myself." Rook glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Are you sure that's a good idea, Captain? We don't know what's waiting for us down there." "I'm not sending anyone else into that without knowing what we're dealing with," Layla said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "We'll do a quick sweep, assess the situation, and get out. If there's anything hostile down there, we're not sticking around." Rook nodded, though the tension in his face didn't ease. "I'll get the team ready." The landing bay was cold and silent as the Vanguard shuttle touched down on the colony's surface. The air was thin, stale, and the faint hum of the emergency power systems was the only sound that broke the oppressive quiet. Layla stepped out of the shuttle, her boots echoing against the metal floor as she led the landing party deeper into the colony. Rook and two other crew members, Mira, a medic, and Jansen, an engineer, followed closely behind, their weapons at the ready. The colony's corridors were dark, the emergency lights flickering weakly as they passed. The once pristine walls were covered in dust and grime, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the air. It was clear that no one had been here for a long time. "Stay close," Layla warned as they moved through the dimly lit halls. "We don't know what's down here." Mira scanned the area with her handheld device, searching for any signs of life. "I'm not picking up anything," she said quietly. "No life forms, no heat signatures. It's like the place is completely dead." Jansen grunted, his eyes scanning the walls nervously. "Feels like a tomb." Layla didn't disagree. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the colony itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Signals coming from up ahead," Rook said, checking his scanner. "We're close." They rounded a corner and found themselves in front of a large, reinforced door. It was partially open, the metal warped and bent as if something had forced its way through. "Looks like someone or something wanted to get in here," Jansen muttered, eyeing the damaged door warily. Layla approached the door, peering inside. Beyond the door was a small control room, its walls lined with consoles and monitors. Most of the equipment was dead, but one console in the corner still blinked with a faint green light. "That's where the signal's coming from," Rook said, moving to the console. Layla followed him inside, her eyes scanning the room for any signs of life. It was empty, except for the consoles and the faint hum of the emergency power. Rook tapped a few buttons on the console, bringing up the data. "It's a repeating distress signal," he said, frowning. "Set to go off every hour. But there's something else here. A message. A message." Layla's brow furrowed. "Play it." Rook activated the playback, and a distorted voice filled the room. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but the words were unmistakable. "The light is gone. We are not alone. They are coming." Layla's heart skipped a beat. It was the same message they had heard before from the other colonies. The same cryptic warning, but there was something different this time. Something that sent a chill down her spine. Before she could react, a loud crash echoed through the colony, followed by the sound of metal scraping against metal. It came from somewhere deep below them, reverberating through the walls like a distant rumble. "What the hell was that?" Jansen asked, his voice tense. Layla's eyes narrowed, her hand instinctively reaching for her weapon. "We need to move, now." As they turned to leave, the lights flickered again, and for a brief moment, Layla thought she saw something, just a shadow, move at the edge of her vision. They weren't alone. The sound of scraping metal echoed through the silent corridors of Colony A7 as Layla and her team made their way back through the winding passages. Every step they took seemed to grow heavier, the atmosphere thickening with an unseen tension. It was as if the colony itself had awoken from its long slumber, and now something was watching them from the shadows. Rook led the way, his scanner in hand, though the device was picking up nothing but faint electrical signals and the dying hum of the emergency power systems. Behind him, Mira and Jansen moved cautiously, their weapons raised. Layla, bringing up the rear, kept her hand close to her sidearm, her senses on high alert. "We need to get back to the shuttle," Layla said, her voice low but firm. "If something is down here, we're not equipped to deal with it. Not without more intel." "Whatever it was," Mira whispered, her eyes darting around the darkened hallways. It didn't sound human. Layla didn't respond. She didn't need to. The truth hung heavy in the air between them. Whatever had caused that noise, whatever had breached the colony's reinforced doors, it wasn't something they had dealt with before. And if the cryptic message they had uncovered was any indication, they were now in the presence of the same force that had consumed the other colonies. As they turned a corner, the lights flickered again, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. Layla's breath caught in her throat as she caught a glimpse of movement, just a fleeting shape disappearing into the darkness ahead. "Hold," she commanded, raising a hand. The team froze in place, their eyes wide, every muscle in their bodies tensed. "What is it?" Rook asked, his voice barely a whisper. Layla scanned the hallway ahead, her heart pounding in her chest. "I saw something moving, just up ahead. Could be a malfunctioning service drone," Jansen suggested, though even he didn't sound convinced. Oh, a loud crash from behind cut him off. The team spun around, weapons raised, but there was nothing there. The corridor stretched out into darkness, silent and still. "We're being hunted," Rook muttered, his face pale. "Whatever it is, it's toying with us." Layla clenched her jaw. "Keep moving. We're almost to the shuttle." They picked up the pace, their footsteps quickening as they made their way through the labyrinthine corridors. But the further they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air was thick with the weight of something unseen, something that was drawing closer with every step they took. As they approached the docking bay, Myra's scanner suddenly beeped, its screen flickering with new data. "Wait, I'm picking up something. There's movement ahead." Layla's stomach tightened. "How many?" Mira frowned at the screen, her face illuminated by its pale glow. "It's hard to tell. The signal is weak, but there's definitely something there. Multiple somethings." Layla cursed under her breath. They had no choice but to push forward. They couldn't stay in the colony any longer, not with whatever was stalking them. "Weapons ready," she ordered. "We're moving in." They rounded the final corner, emerging into the docking bay. The shuttle sat in the center of the room, its ramp down, waiting for them to board. But something was wrong. The air in the bay was thick, heavy, as if the atmosphere itself was distorting. And then they saw them. At first, Layla couldn't make out what she was seeing. The shapes were humanoid, tall, thin figures standing in the shadows near the walls of the bay. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, the truth became clear. They weren't human. The creatures stood motionless, their elongated limbs and pale, translucent skin barely visible in the faint light. Their faces were devoid of features, save for two deep, black pits where their eyes should have been. They didn't move. They didn't breathe. They simply watched, their empty eyes locked on the intruders. "Holy shit," Rook breathed, taking a step back. "Stay calm," Layla said, though even she felt the cold grip of fear tightening in her chest. we're getting to that shuttle." As if responding to her words, the creatures stirred. Their movements were slow, almost mechanical, as they began to step forward, their limbs bending in unnatural ways. The silence of the docking bay was shattered by the sound of metal scraping against metal as the creature's sharp, bony feet dragged across the floor. "Move," Layla shouted, raising her weapon. The team broke into a sprint, racing toward the shuttle. The creatures followed, their movements unnervingly fast despite their awkward gait. Layla fired her sidearm, the sharp crack of gunfire echoing through the bay. The energy bolt struck one of the creatures in the chest, but it barely flinched, continuing its relentless pursuit. "Jansen, seal the ramp," Layla ordered as they reached the shuttle. Jansen bolted up the ramp, his fingers flying over the controls as the heavy door began to rise. Layla and Rook fired at the approaching creatures, but the shots seemed to have little effect. The creatures were relentless, their dark, empty eyes locked on the team with an unnatural focus. "Get inside," Jansen shouted as the ramp sealed shut. The door slammed closed just as one of the creatures reached it, its long, bony fingers scraping against the metal. Layla stumbled into the cockpit, her heart racing as she strapped herself into the co-pilot's seat. Rook took the pilot's seat, his hands trembling as he powered up the shuttle's engines. "They're all over the bay," Mira said, her voice tight with fear. "There's more of them out there than we thought." "We're leaving," Layla said through gritted teeth. "Get us out of here now." The shuttle's engines roared to life, and they lifted off the surface of the colony. The creatures below swarmed the docking bay, their thin limbs reaching out toward the ship as it ascended. Layla could feel the tension in the air as the shuttle's thrusters engaged, pushing them up and away from the dark, silent colony. For a moment, there was nothing but the steady hum of the engines and the weight of their collective fear. But as they broke through the upper atmosphere and into the cold vacuum of space, Layla allowed herself to breathe again. "They didn't follow us," Rook said, his voice shaky. "We're clear." Layla nodded, though her mind was still racing. The creatures they had encountered, whatever they were, weren't just mindless predators. They had intelligence, they had purpose, and that made them even more dangerous. "What the hell were those things?" Jansen asked, his face pale. "I don't know," Layla admitted, her hands tightening around the armrests of her seat. "But whatever they are, they're connected to the collapse of the colonies. They've been lying in wait, hiding in the dark, and now they're waking up." Mira sat down heavily in one of the chairs, her face etched with exhaustion. "What do we do now, Captain? We barely made it out of there alive. And if those things are out there, what chance do we have?" Layla leaned back in her seat, staring out at the stars that now stretched endlessly before them. The weight of the question hung in the air between them, heavy and oppressive. The colonies were falling, one by one, consumed by an unseen force that no one had prepared for. And now they were facing something far beyond their understanding. But there was no turning back. Not now. Not after what they had seen. "We find out where they came from," Layla said, her voice hardening with resolve. "And we stop them. Whatever it takes." Hours later, Layla sat alone in the darkened cockpit, her mind still reeling from the events on Colony A7. The shuttle drifted silently through space, its crew resting in the quarters behind her. But Layla couldn't sleep. Her thoughts were consumed by the creatures they had encountered, their dark, empty eyes, their unnatural movements, and the eerie sense that they had been waiting for this moment for a long, long time. She stared out at the endless void, her mind racing with questions. Or what were these creatures? Where had they come from? And more importantly, what did they want? The answers, she knew, lay somewhere out there in the vast expanse of space, beyond the reach of any star, hidden in the dark corners of the galaxy. But finding those answers would not be easy. The colonies were falling, and humanity was on the brink of extinction. If they didn't act soon, it would be too late. As Layla sat in the silence of the cockpit, a faint beeping sound pulled her from her thoughts. She frowned, glancing at the console. The long-range scanners had picked up something, a faint signal, similar to the one they had detected from Colony A7. But this one was different. It was stronger, closer. She leaned forward, her heart racing, as she brought the signal up on the screen. It was coming from a nearby system, not far from their current location. Another colony, another distress signal. Layla's mind raced. The creatures were spreading, moving from colony to colony, consuming everything in their path. But why? What were they looking for? She didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The cold vacuum of space stretched endlessly in all directions as the shuttle, battered and tired from the escape, drifted toward the new signal. The crew aboard the Vanguard had fallen into an uneasy silence, the weight of the unknown pressing on them. The mysterious creatures they had encountered on Colony A7 still haunted their minds, and the signal that now blinked on their radar was a grim reminder that they weren't done running yet. Layla sat in the captain's chair, staring at the signal's coordinates as they approached. The steady blip of the radar echoed in the otherwise quiet cockpit, each pulse tugging at her nerves. The new signal was stronger than the one they had encountered before, which meant one of two things. There were survivors, or the source of the signal was something else entirely. Rook stood by her side, his eyes glued to the monitor, his face a mask of determination. "It's coming from the orbit of a gas giant, Captain," he said quietly. "Another colony. This one was built on a mining station. I don't see any signs of activity yet. But we know what's waiting for us down there." Layla finished for him, her voice cold. "And if those creatures are on this station too, we need to be prepared for worse." Rook nodded grimly. "We should assume the worst. They're spreading, moving through the colonies like a plague. Whatever this is, it's not stopping." Behind them, the rest of the crew stood ready. Mira was checking her medical supplies for the 10th time, her face pale but resolute. Jansen had armed himself with what little weaponry they had left, a heavy pulse rifle slung over his shoulder, his jaw set with grim determination. As they neared the source of the signal, the station came into view on the screen, a dark silhouette against the backdrop of the gas giant. It was massive, much larger than the colony on A7, with long, sprawling arms extending out into space like the twisted limbs of some ancient beast. The station had once been a hub of mining operations, extracting precious gases and minerals from planet below. But now it was eerily silent, its lights dark, its docking bays empty. "There's no power," Mira observed, her voice a hushed whisper. "It's completely dead." "Not completely," Jansen replied, gesturing toward the blinking signal on the console. "That distress beacon is still active, which means someone or something is still down there." Layla's grip on the armrests tightened. "We need to investigate. We can't ignore this. If there are survivors, we need to get them out of there before the creatures reach them. But if it's a trap," Rook began, his voice trailing off. "We'll handle it," Layla said, her voice firm. "We don't have a choice. We're already too far in to turn back now." The shuttle descended toward the mining station, its thrusters cutting through the thin atmosphere that surrounded the dead facility. As they approached, the docking bay doors opened with a slow, mechanical groan, as if the station itself had been waiting for their arrival. It was unsettling, and the unease in the shuttle grew with every passing second. "Something doesn't feel right," Mira muttered, her eyes scanning the darkened corridors visible through the docking bay's viewport. "It's like it knows we're here." Layla glanced at her, feeling the same cold sensation creep down her spine. "Stay sharp. If there's something waiting for us, we'll deal with it. But we have to know what's going on in there." The shuttle touched down with a soft thud, and the team disembarked into the dead silence of the docking bay. The air was cold, thin, and there was an unnatural stillness to the station, as if time itself had frozen in place. Layla led the way, her blaster held tightly in her hands, her every sense on high alert. The docking bay was empty. No signs of life, no movement, just rows of deactivated machinery and the skeletal remains of long-abandoned mining equipment. The only sound was the faint hum of the emergency beacon coming from deeper inside the station. "Where's the beacon located?" Layla asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rook checked his scanner. It's coming from the Central Operations Hub, about 3 levels up. Layla nodded. We'll head there first. Stay close, and keep an eye out for anything unusual. They moved cautiously through the corridors of the station, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The deeper they went, the more unnerving the atmosphere became. The walls were stained with rust and decay, and strange, twisted shadows seemed to flicker at the edges of their vision. Do you hear that? Mira asked suddenly, her voice tense. Layla paused, listening carefully. At first, there was nothing but the sound of their own breathing, but then she heard it, a faint scratching, like nails on metal, coming from somewhere in the walls. They're here, Jansen said, his voice tight with fear. Just like before, Layla's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. We need to keep moving. We're too exposed here. As they continued, the scratching grew louder, closer. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, and something was crawling through them, watching their every move. They reached the operations hub, the door sliding open with a low hiss. Inside, the control room was dimly lit, the consoles flickering weakly with what little power remained. In the center of the room was the source of the distress signal, a blinking console, repeating the same message over and over. But there was no one there. No bodies, Rook said quietly, his brow furrowed. No signs of struggle, just nothing. Layla approached the console, her eyes scanning the data on the screen. The message was the same as before. The light is gone. We are not alone. They are coming. She clenched her fists, frustration bubbling up inside her. Who sent this? There has to be something we're missing. Mira, who had been scanning the room with her medical tricorder, suddenly froze. Captain, I'm picking up life signs. Layla turned sharply toward her. Where? Myra's hands shook as she pointed toward a hatch in the far corner of the room. Down below, in the lower levels. It's faint, but it's there. Someone's alive down there. Rook moved to the hatch, pulling it open with a loud creak. If they're hiding down there, it means they're either trapped or worse. Layla didn't hesitate. We're going down. We can't leave without knowing what's happening. Jansen looked uneasy, his grip tightening on his rifle. Captain, if those things are down there, we're not leaving anyone behind, Layla said firmly. Let's move. The lower levels of the station were even darker, the air heavy with the smell of decay and rust. The walls were narrow, claustrophobic, and the faint sound of scratching was constant now, coming from all directions. Layla's heart pounded in her chest as they moved deeper into the bowels of the station, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. They reached a small chamber at the end of the corridor, the door sealed shut with heavy locks. Layla motioned for Jansen to open it, and with a few quick motions, the locks disengaged, the door sliding open with a hiss. Inside, the chamber was small and cramped, filled with stacks of old supplies and machinery. But at the far end, huddled in a corner, was a figure, a man, dressed in the tattered remains of a station worker's uniform. He looked up at them with wide, terrified eyes, his face gaunt and pale. Please, please, you have to help me, he whispered, his voice weak. They're coming. Layla knelt beside him, her expression softening. We're here to help. What happened here? Where is everyone? The man shook his head, his eyes darting around the room, as if expecting something to appear at any moment. They took them, one by one. We tried to fight, but they were too strong, too fast. They come from the walls, from the dark. You can't stop them. Layla's heart sank. The creatures. The man nodded, his hands trembling. They've been here for months, maybe longer. We thought we could hold them off, but they're too many. We thought the beacon would bring help, but no one came. No one ever comes. Rook stepped forward, his face grim. We need to get him back to the ship, Captain. The longer we stay here, the more dangerous it gets. Layla nodded. We're leaving, now. But as they turned to leave, the scratching in the walls grew louder. The lights flickered again, and this time, they didn't come back on. We need to move, Jansen shouted, his voice echoing through the dark. They raced back through the narrow corridors, the man stumbling behind them as they made their way toward the docking bay. But the creatures were close now, their presence almost tangible in the darkness. Layla could hear them, moving, slithering through the walls, closing in on them from all sides. Just as they reached the docking bay, the wall beside them exploded in a shower of metal and sparks, and one of the creatures lunged out, its long, bony fingers reaching for Mira. She screamed, firing her weapon, but the creature was too fast. It slammed into her, knocking her to the ground as it loomed over her, its black, empty eyes staring down into her soul. Layla fired, the blast from her blaster sending the creature flying backward into the wall. She grabbed Myra's arm, pulling her to her feet as they raced toward the shuttle. The creatures were everywhere now, pouring out of the walls, their pale, twisted bodies moving with unnatural speed. Layla fired wildly, trying to keep them at bay as the shuttle's ramp lowered. "Get on board," she shouted, her voice hoarse with fear. The team scrambled onto the shuttle, the man barely able to keep up as he stumbled behind them. As soon as they were inside, Rook slammed the door shut, sealing them inside. The shuttle lifted off, the creatures swarming below them as they ascended into the sky. Layla collapsed into her seat, her body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. "They're not just on the station," she said quietly, her voice shaking. "They're everywhere, and they're coming for all of us." The shuttle drifted back into space, leaving the station and the nightmare behind them. But Layla knew that this was just the beginning. The creatures were spreading, moving through the colonies like a shadow, consuming everything in their path. And if they didn't find a way to stop them, it would be the end of humanity's last hope. "Set a course for the Vanguard," Layla ordered, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "We need to warn the other colonies before it's too late." The shuttle glided silently through the dark void, carrying its battered and exhausted crew away from the station. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. No one spoke, even as the engines hummed and the stars drifted past the viewports. The weight of what they had encountered clung to them like a second skin. Layla sat in the cockpit, her hands gripping the controls tightly, her mind racing. The creatures, they were spreading. Every colony they'd visited, every signal they'd traced, had led to more questions and more horror. This wasn't an isolated outbreak. This was a coordinated invasion, a dark force lurking at the edges of human space, waiting for the moment to strike. Behind her, Rook and the others remained in silence. Mira was tending to the injured man they had rescued from the mining station. His eyes were still wide with terror, his body trembling uncontrollably as she checked him over. "He's in shock," Mira said quietly. "Whatever he's seen, it's broken him." Layla didn't respond. Her mind was elsewhere, already calculating their next move. They had to warn the other colonies. They had to prepare. But how could they prepare for something like this? "We need answers," Rook said finally, breaking the silence. "This can't just be some random alien species. They're organized, they're precise. It's almost like they've been waiting for the right moment to strike." Layla nodded, her jaw tight. They've been hiding in the dark, waiting for humanity to reach out too far. And now that we've spread ourselves across the stars, they're coming out of the shadows. Jansen, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, his pulse rifle still clutched in his hands, looked up. "If that's true, then we're screwed. We don't have the resources to fight something like this. Hell, we barely have enough to keep the lights on in the colonies we still control, which is why we need to stop them before they wipe out the rest of us," Layla said, her voice cold and determined. "We need to find out where they came from, what they want, and how we can stop them." Mira glanced at the injured man, her brow furrowed. "Do you think he knows something? He survived longer than anyone else." Layla turned her gaze toward the man, who was now sitting up, staring blankly at the wall. His eyes were hollow, as though whatever life he had once possessed had been drained from him. "Maybe," she said quietly, "but he's not in any condition to talk right now." As the shuttle drifted toward the Vanguard, the ship came into view, its dark silhouette standing out against the backdrop of the distant stars. The old colony ship had been their home for months now, a floating lifeboat in the midst of an ocean of uncertainty. It had seen better days. Its hull was pockmarked with the scars of time and battle, its systems barely holding together, but it was still functional. And for now, that was enough. "We'll dock in 5, Rook said, his hands moving over the controls. "I'll have the crew prepped for debrief." Layla nodded, but her mind was already moving ahead. There was no time for debriefs or recovery. They needed to act, and fast. The docking procedure was quick and efficient, and soon the crew of the shuttle was back aboard the Vanguard. The injured man was taken to the med bay, where Mira and her assistants began treating him. Layla, however, didn't have the luxury of rest. She marched straight to the command center, her thoughts racing. Rook followed close behind, his face a mask of concern. "What's the plan, Captain?" he asked, his voice low. Layla stopped in front of the main console, bringing up a holographic map of the nearby colonies. The map flickered, showing the positions of the remaining human outposts scattered across the galaxy. Most were in the far reaches, isolated and vulnerable. "We need to reach out to the colonies," Layla said, her voice filled with urgency. "Warn them about what's coming. If they don't start preparing defenses now, they'll fall just like the others." Rook crossed his arms, his brow furrowed. "Even if we warn them, what can they do? We don't have the firepower to fight these things. We'll have to figure that out as we go," Layla replied. "Right now, it's about survival. We need to consolidate our forces, gather everyone we can, and figure out where these creatures are coming from. If we can't stop them, at least we can slow them down." Rook sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "And how do we convince them that this isn't just another crisis? That these things are real?" Layla turned to face him, her eyes hard. "We show them what's left of the colonies we've already seen. We tell them about the survivors we've rescued, and we give them a choice. Prepare for the worst, or be consumed by it." Rook nodded slowly, though the doubt in his eyes remained. "I hope they listen, Captain, because if they don't, we're all finished." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. The Vanguard's crew, small but dedicated, worked tirelessly to send out emergency transmissions to the remaining colonies, warning them of the threat. Most of the colonies were slow to respond, their leaders skeptical of the danger. After all, the galaxy had always been a harsh place, and many had seen their fair share of crises. But Layla's warnings carried weight. The distress signals from fallen colonies, combined with the first-hand accounts from her crew, were enough to shake even the most stubborn leaders into action. Slowly, messages began to trickle in from the other outposts, promising to bolster defenses and prepare for evacuation if necessary. In the meantime, the crew continued to care for the man they had rescued. His condition had stabilized, but he remained weak and unresponsive. Mira had done everything she could to treat his physical wounds, but whatever trauma he had endured had left deep psychological scars. Layla visited him in the med bay, sitting beside his bed as he stared blankly at the ceiling. "You're safe now," she said softly. "We got you out of there." The man blinked slowly, his eyes shifting to meet hers for the first time. You don't understand," he whispered, his voice weak. "It's not over. It's never over." Layla frowned, leaning closer. "What do you mean? What's not over?" "Them," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're everywhere. They're in the walls, in the dark. You can't stop them. You can't run." Layla felt a chill run down her spine. "Who are they? What do they want?" The man closed his eyes, his body trembling. "They want everything. They want us gone. We're just in their way." Later that evening, Layla gathered her officers in the Vanguard's war room. The holographic map of the colonies hovered in the center of the room, casting a soft blue light over the gathered crew. Rook, Mira, and Jansen sat around the table, their faces tense and grim. "The situation is worse than we thought," Layla said, her voice low. "The colonies are isolated, and most of them aren't prepared for what's coming. If these creatures keep spreading at the rate they are, it won't be long before there's nothing left." Mira shook her head, her expression one of disbelief. "But why now? Why are they attacking now?" After all these years, what changed? Layla glanced at the map, her brow furrowed. We don't know, but whatever their plan is, they've been waiting for this. And if we don't find out what they're after, we'll never be able to stop them. Jansen leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. We need to track them back to their source. Find out where they came from, how they got here. If we can figure out what started this, maybe we can find a way to end it. Layla nodded. Agreed. But we're flying blind right now. We don't have enough information. That man we rescued, Rook said quietly. He's seen things. He knows more than he's telling us. If we can get him to talk. Layla sighed. I don't want to push him too hard. He's been through hell. But if he knows something that could help us, Rook began. Layla raised a hand, cutting him off. I'll talk to him again, but we can't force him. If he's going to tell us anything, it has to be on his terms. Rook nodded, though his expression remained troubled. In the meantime, we should focus on consolidating our forces. If we can get enough of the colonies to rally together, we might stand a chance of holding them off long enough to figure out what we're dealing with. Layla's gaze swept over the room, her eyes hard. Then, that's our plan. We'll gather our forces, track these creatures to their source, and stop them before they wipe out the rest of us. Days passed as the Vanguard made its way through the star systems, sending out warnings and coordinating with the remaining colonies. Some responded quickly, their leaders rallying their people to prepare for the coming storm. Others were slower, still clinging to the hope that the threat was exaggerated or that they would somehow be spared. But Layla knew better. The creatures weren't stopping. They were growing stronger, moving faster, spreading further with each passing day. And the more they spread, the more it became clear that this was no random attack. This was a war that humanity hadn't even realized it was fighting. Late one night, Layla was awoken by a soft knock on the door to her quarters. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, and opened the door to find Mira standing there, her expression tense. It's him, Mira said quietly. He's asking for you. Layla's heart quickened. Without a word, she followed Mira to the med bay, where the man lay in his bed, his face pale and drawn. His eyes were clearer now, though still haunted by the things he had seen. You wanted to talk to me? Layla asked, sitting beside him. The man nodded weakly. I've seen them. I know what they want. Layla leaned forward, her heart pounding. Tell me, what are they after? The man's eyes flickered with fear. They're not from here. They're not from our galaxy. They're invaders. And they're looking for something buried deep in the colonies. Something ancient. Layla's blood ran cold. What is it? What are they trying to find? The man's voice dropped to a whisper. A weapon. Something powerful. Something that could destroy us all. The revelation hit Layla like a punch to the gut. A weapon. Something ancient. Buried in the colonies? Her mind raced as the implications began to sink in. These creatures weren't just mindlessly destroying colonies. They were searching for something. Something that could tip the balance of power in the galaxy. Something dangerous enough to drive them across the stars. She looked down at the man lying before her, his frail body barely able to hold itself together. The fear in his eyes was palpable, and yet there was a flicker of something else. Hope. No, it was too weak for hope, but it was knowledge. He knew something critical, something that could give them a fighting chance. What weapon? Layla asked, her voice low but urgent. Where is it? What are they looking for? The man swallowed hard, his throat dry and cracked from days of dehydration and fear. They're searching the ruins, he whispered. The old colonial sites, the ones built before the war, buried deep in the foundations. Some kind of artifact left behind by, I don't know who, but it's powerful, Captain. I heard the others talking before they disappeared. Layla leaned closer, every nerve in her body on edge. Do you know which colony? Which one has this weapon? The man's eyes fluttered as though the effort of staying conscious was too much. There were rumors, the Outer Rim colonies, the ones closest to the edge of the galaxy. It's hidden in one of the old mining facilities. Colony 12, no, 13. Colony 13. Layla stood up straight, her heart racing. "Rook," she shouted over the intercom. "Get in here, now." Rook rushed into the med bay moments later, his face etched with concern. "Captain, we have a lead," Layla said, her voice trembling with intensity. "The creatures aren't just attacking randomly. They're looking for something, a weapon, hidden in Colony 13. If we don't get there first, they'll find it, and God knows what will happen then." Rook's eyes widened. A weapon? But what kind of weapon could be buried in a backwater colony? Layla shook her head. "I don't know, and I don't care. All I know is, if they're after it, we can't let them have it. Gather the crew. We're leaving for Colony 13 immediately." The Vanguard roared to life as its engines engaged, propelling the aging ship through the darkness of space with renewed purpose. Inside, the crew prepared for what was sure to be the most critical mission of their lives. Layla stood in the command center, her eyes fixed on the star map as the coordinates for Colony 13 blinked on the screen. "This is it," she said to Rook, who stood by her side, his jaw clenched. "If we can get there before they do, we might have a shot at stopping them." Rook nodded grimly. "What do we know about Colony 13? "Not much," Layla admitted. "It was one of the last colonies built before the war. It was supposed to be a mining outpost, but it was abandoned early. The records are incomplete, but there were rumors that the colonists found something there, something they weren't supposed to. And now, those creatures are after it," Rook said, finishing her thought. "Do we have any idea what kind of resistance we'll face when we get there?" Layla sighed, her fingers tapping the armrest of her chair. "We have to assume the worst. We've seen what those things can do. If they've already reached the colony, it's likely swarming with them. We'll be ready," Rook said, his voice firm. "The crew knows what's at stake." Layla glanced at him, her expression softening slightly. "Make sure they do, Rook. This is the last stand. If we fail here, there won't be any colonies left to defend." Hours later, the Vanguard dropped out of hyperspace, the distant shape of Colony 13 looming ahead. It was a desolate, barren place, built on the surface of a cold, rocky moon that orbited a dying star. The colony itself was a series of massive mining structures, half buried in the gray dust of the moon's surface. There were no lights, no signs of life, just the empty, crumbling buildings, swallowed by the shadows of the decaying landscape. "They're here," Layla said quietly, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the surface from the viewport. "I can feel it." Rook checked the sensors. "I'm picking up movement on the surface. Multiple contacts. It's them." Layla's heart sank, but she steeled herself. "Then we don't have much time. We need to land as close to the central mining facility as possible. That's where the weapon will be." Jansen's voice crackled over the comm. "Captain, the shuttle's prepped and ready. We're good to go whenever you are. Let's do this," Layla said, her voice filled with determination. The shuttle descended toward the surface, the harsh winds of the moon's thin atmosphere buffeting the craft as it neared the ground. Layla, Rook, Mira, and Jansen were all strapped into their seats, their weapons ready. This was it, the last stand. They couldn't afford to fail. The shuttle touched down in the shadow of the central mining facility, a massive, fortress-like structure built into the side of a mountain. The team disembarked quickly, their boots crunching on the dusty surface as they made their way toward the entrance. The facility's doors were broken, hanging off their hinges, and the walls were covered in strange, twisted markings, evidence of the creature's presence. The air was cold and thin, and every breath felt labored as they moved deeper into the facility. "This place gives me the creeps," Jansen muttered, his pulse rifle at the ready. "It feels like a graveyard." Layla didn't respond. She could feel the tension in the air, the sense of impending doom. The creatures were here, somewhere, watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. They reached the control room, its consoles long dead and covered in dust. But Layla's eyes were drawn to a massive vault door at the far end of the room. It was sealed shut, its surface covered in strange, alien symbols. "That's it," Layla said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The weapon's behind that door." Rook approached the console beside the door, his fingers flying over the controls. It's locked down tight. Looks like it's been sealed for centuries. Can you open it? Layla asked. Rook nodded. I can try, but it'll take time. We don't have time, Layla said, glancing over her shoulder. They're coming. I can feel it. Rook worked quickly, bypassing the ancient security systems as best he could. The seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Layla kept her weapon trained on the entrance, her nerves on edge. Then, just as Rook was about to break through the final lock, the walls around them began to shake. A low, guttural growl echoed through the facility, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against metal. They're here, Jansen shouted, his eyes wide with fear. Layla's heart pounded in her chest. Rook, get that door open now. Rook cursed under his breath, his hands moving faster. I'm trying, Captain. Just a few more seconds. The creatures burst into the room, their pale, twisted bodies moving with unnatural speed. Mira fired first, her blaster sending a bolt of energy into one of the creature's chests. It staggered but kept coming, its black, soulless eyes locked on them. Hold them off, Layla shouted, firing her weapon as more creatures poured into the room. The battle was chaotic, the sound of gunfire and the creatures' screeches filling the air. The team fought with everything they had, but the creatures were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. Just as Layla was beginning to fear they wouldn't hold out, there was a loud hiss, and the vault door began to slide open. I've got it, Rook shouted. The doors opened. Fall back, Layla ordered, firing one last shot before retreating into the vault. They rushed inside, the massive door, sealing, shut behind them just as the creatures reached it. The room was plunged into silence, the only sound their ragged breathing as they collapsed against the walls, exhausted but alive. Inside the vault, the room was dark, but as Layla activated her flashlight, her beam illuminated a large object in the center of the chamber. It was ancient, covered in strange markings, its surface shimmering with a faint, unnatural light. This is it, Layla said, her voice filled with awe. The weapon. Rook approached the object cautiously. But what is it? How does it work? Before Layla could answer, the object began to hum softly, its light growing brighter. A deep, resonant voice echoed through the chamber, speaking in a language none of them could understand. Captain, Mira said, her voice trembling. I don't think we were meant to find this. Layla's heart raced as the weapon's hum grew louder, its energy filling the room. The creatures outside pounded on the vault door, their screeches growing more frantic. What do we do? Jansen asked, his face pale with fear. Layla stared at the weapon, her mind racing. If this was what the creatures were after, then it had the power to either destroy them or doom them all. We have to use it, Layla said, her voice steady despite the fear in her chest. It's the only way. Rook looked at her, his eyes wide. Are you sure, Captain? We don't even know what it does. Layla nodded. We don't have a choice. She stepped forward, her hand reaching out to touch the shimmering surface of the weapon. The moment her fingers made contact, the room was flooded with light, and the weapon's hum became a deafening roar. Outside the vault, the creatures screamed in agony as the light burst from the facility, engulfing everything in its path. And then there was silence. When Layla opened her eyes, she found herself lying on the cold floor of the vault. The light had faded, and the weapon was silent once more. Captain. Rook's voice was soft, filled with disbelief. They're gone. The creatures, they're gone. Layla sat up slowly, her body aching from the strain of the battle. What happened? Rook shook his head. I don't know, but whatever that thing did, it worked. The team slowly made their way out of the vault, stepping into the now empty facility. The creatures were gone, their bodies reduced to ash by the weapon's power. Outside, the sky was clear, the desolate moon bathed in the light of the dying star. We did it, Mira said quietly, her eyes filled with wonder. We stopped them. Layla nodded, though her heart was still heavy. For now, As they made their way back to the shuttle, Layla couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The weapon had saved them, but it had also raised more questions than answers. Where had it come from? Who had built it? And what had they unleashed by using it? But for now, they had survived. The colonies were safe, and that, Layla knew, was enough. For now.